Well, I'm really delighted to be able to speak to General Ben Hodges. General Hodges was the commander of U.S. Forces Europe. He had a long, distinguished career in the U.S. military. He was particularly involved with NATO issues, and the reason I'm particularly happy to talk to him is because ever since February 24th of 2022, he has been one of the leading advocates of strong Western and American support for Ukraine. And unlike many of the pundits that are pronouncing on issues like the anticipated, Ukrainian counteroffensive, General Hodges actually knows something about military operations, and I think it's a very good time to be able to discuss this. So, Ben, if I may,
please.
You have been much more optimistic than most observers right from the beginning of the Russian invasion. And my question is, why have you been optimistic? I think you've been proven right up till now with the advances that Ukraine made last year. And you're still predicting that they're going to see considerable success in this coming counteroffensive. So maybe you can talk about that.
Well, thanks for this privilege. And I acknowledge that I am in a minority position. Everybody wants Ukraine to win, but not everybody believes that it's possible. So a lot of really good, smart people will disagree with some of this, and I could be wrong. But we know from history that war is a test of will, and it's clear that Ukrainian people and Ukrainian soldiers have superior will. I don't think you'll find many Russian soldiers that really actually want to be in Ukraine. Ukrainians are defending their homes. The Russians are the invader, and most of them are conscripts or released from prison, and it's still, even with modern technology, the Russian army is still a czarist army in its leadership style and enforcement of discipline.
So really centralized.
Very centralized. I mean, there's a report that just came out, the scandal of how much money was spent on this new command center in Moscow, from which every decision is made. And so, but that's the way they've always been. And when war, and this comes to the other thing, that war is also a test of logistics. And when in the Soviet methodology, where it was about math, superior artillery, numbers of artillery, massed infantry, massed tanks, massed aircraft, then a centralized approach works. But that clearly has not worked in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians have been more agile, more adept, and again, it goes back to this will. So that's the main reason I am optimistic. Now, if you look at what's happened just over the past few weeks, every indicator is trending in favor of Ukraine, except our will. The incoherence of the Russian general staff, the leadership, they still haven't figured out who's actually in charge. The very open, visceral hatred between Mr. Prigozhin, Kadyrov, Shoigu, Gerasimov. These guys hate each other, and so you don't have a coherent defensive plan. In the last week, we've heard of a €3 billion pledge by Germany. That's on top of what they've already done. The French, the UK, even just now, our president has finally made the decision to allow other nations to provide F-16, for example. So all of these things are trending in favor of Ukraine. Even around Bakhmut, you're seeing, which is not strategic for Ukraine, except that the Russians are willing to bleed there. So Ukrainians are going to allow that while they continue to build up their forces for this, what we think is a coming counteroffensive. So the key will be, will the United States, will our president say what our desired strategic outcome really is? So far he hasn't. That's what's missing. And the president has not said, we want Ukraine to win. We need Ukraine to win, and then provide everything that's required.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the outcome that we're seeking more specifically. But before we get to that, you've actually had direct experience working with Ukrainians in training programs. Maybe you can talk about that experience a little bit.
back in about 2015, I think, is when we started a training program in Ukraine at the Yavoriv Training Center near Lviv in the far western part of Ukraine. We were tasked to help set up a training center through which Ukrainian battalions could rotate before they headed east to what was then called the ATO, the Anti-Terrorism Operations Zone, the Donbass. And so we saw right away that while they still had a long way to go in terms of the institutional army, and you still had several of the older, what we call the big hat Soviet-trained officers, the younger officers, the younger soldiers, showed me a resilience, a toughness, independence of thought, and the most amazing ability to learn and adapt new technologies. I've never seen any soldiers, including our own, that are as fast as Ukrainians at integrating new technologies and new ideas. And so what we saw, in the absence of a strategy from any administration for the Black Sea region, at least we saw Ukrainian troops that were ready to learn, were willing to learn. And General Mazhenko was the chief of the General Staff at the time. Even though he was an old school Soviet trained officer, you could see from him that he still knew how to do stuff. I mean, he was professional enough. There still were too many of the older big hat guys around him. I think we're now in a place where you've got General Zaluzny, of course, who came in. He never served in the Soviet.
So he wasn't tainted by that Soviet experience.
Not to the same extent. Obviously, all of his commanders would have been, but he was not personally. So now we see an army that I don't want to overstate this, but we see an army where most of them were not even in uniform 18 months ago. That is very adept and has a Western approach to decision making, decentralized command and control.
Right. So maybe we can talk about the operational expectations that you have. I mean, we'll get to the long-term strategic goal, but the operational expectations for this offensive. Now, presumably, the main objective is really not the Donbass. It's the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast to the south along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine. How do you expect that operation to unfold?
Well, of course, you hear this phrase, spring offensive, tossed around. That never came from the General Staff. That was a creation, I think, of journalists and old people like me trying to guess about what was going to happen. But the Ukrainian General Staff has really impressed me with their discipline, the way they protect information, their understanding of the operational art, how to design a campaign and then properly prioritize the available resources that they have. I think that Crimea is the decisive terrain, and so this counteroffensive is designed to set the conditions for the ultimate liberation of Crimea. You could kill every Russian within about 200 kilometers of Bakhmut, and that would not change the strategic situation. Liberating Crimea changes everything. So what are they going to do? I think General Zaluzny and the General Staff have said there are three conditions that need to be met before they're ready to go. The first one is the condition of their own forces. Do they have enough combat power that could penetrate all of these linear Russian defenses, the trench lines, the Dragon's Teeth, the minefields, all of that, and make it all the way to, I think, to the Sea of Azov, to cut the so-called land bridge, as well as to secure the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia. I think they are very, very concerned, understandably, for that thing. So do they have the combat power to do that? That's going to primarily be armored brigades, tanks, mechanized infantry, armored engineers, self-propelled artillery, air defense that can move forward and attack with overwhelming combat power on a narrow front. There's no need to attack the full 600, 700, 800 miles up front, but where do you want to get overwhelming combat power? And so not only is it numbers, and I think they probably have put together several brigades, more than we know publicly of units that are properly equipped and have been training now for the past few months.
Right.
I mean, none of these were diverted to Bakhmut,
Mm-hmm.
which is why it's so important. The sacrifice at Bakhmut was to allow this to happen. So that's number one. And of course, you've got brigades that are equipped with Ukrainian equipment, brigades that are equipped with captured Russian equipment, and then you'll have brigades that are equipped with German Marder, American Bradley, French AMX. I mean, the whole zoo of Western provided equipment, which will be very capable, but also that's a heck of a logistics challenge. The second condition is the Russian forces. Have they degraded enough the command and control, the headquarters, the logistics of the Russian defenses? We see fuel storage places on fire all the time now, ammunition storage, those kinds of things, transportation network that would make it difficult for the Russians to react and adjust. And then the deception plan. Obviously, the Russians know something is coming, but just like in June of 1944, the Germans knew the Allies were coming, but where, when, and how was still unknown. And so I think that's what the Ukrainian General Staff is working on still. The third condition is the ground. You can't do a single thing about that except wait. And the ground in this part of Ukraine in particular, because of the drainage of so many rivers and where it heads towards towards Crimea and the Black Sea, is particularly nasty when it's wet. So they have to wait until it's dried out enough so that the hundreds of heavy tracked armored vehicles will be able to keep moving, not get stuck literally in the mud. Those are the three conditions. And I think when that's set, then General Zaluzhny will turn to his president and say, we are ready to go.
And I think there's been a lot of pressure from Washington and from other NATO capitals to move up the timetable, but that's probably a big mistake given what you just said about their needing to be ready.
Yeah, I think President Zelensky has said, we'll go when we're ready. Just the other day, he said, we could go right now and we would win, but it would cost us so many more casualties. Whereas if they wait until those three conditions are fully met, to the extent that is feasible, I think, of course, that's entirely a Ukrainian call. And, they know the ground better than we'll ever know. They know the condition of their own forces better. They know the Russian side better than we'll ever know. And so there is a sort of a impatience almost because there's so much coverage of all this. And it's people are anxious to see what's going to happen. And so there is pressure. I think the Ukrainians that will do what they have been doing is they'll make the decision on their time, and they'll do it their way, and I think they will be very successful.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Crimea specifically. So it's a peninsula, it's isolated, there's basically two supply lines. There's one that goes from Russia proper through Melitopol, Mariupol,
right. That's the land bridge.
Yeah, that's the land bridge. And then there's the Kerch Strait Bridge.
Right.
And presumably if the Ukrainians can liberate Kherson, the rest of Kherson Oblast, they're going to be sitting on top of both of those, right? And
yeah, they can already reach some parts of like Melitopol with HIMARS and those kinds of weapon systems, and now with Storm Shadow, they can reach almost all of Crimea. But to really isolate the Crimean Peninsula, I think the key is cutting that land bridge with land forces, and then eliminating the Russian forces that are in on Kherson on the east side of the Dnieper, on the east side of the Dnieper River, and then in Zaporizhia. They'll want to eliminate all of that. And the Kerch Bridge, of course, I don't know what their plan is, but I'm thinking that as long as you don't have a lot of Russian reinforcements and resupply coming in over the bridge, I think they'll leave it up until they're ready, because you want to leave a way for the Russians to get out of there.
Yeah.
Encourage them. Look, there's your off ramp right there, and then once they have finally liberated all of Crimea, which I absolutely believe happens this year, then I think they will destroy that bridge because otherwise it blocks effectively access in and out of the Azov Sea, which will make it very difficult for them to rebuild their economy. But if the bridge starts playing a role in helping Russia defend Crimea, then I think they will go after it.
And you think that they could actually push across that? I mean, that isthmus is only 4 or 5 kilometers wide, but you think they could actually...
Well, of course, this will be extremely difficult. The Perekop Isthmus has always been a challenge for attacking forces. The Russians have a map. They have a history there, too. But I think the key to liberating the Crimean Peninsula is first to make it untenable for Russian forces. And that's why the long-range precision weapons are so important. When you start putting a precision weapon like whether it's Storm Shadow or ATACMS or Great Eagle drones throwing Hellfires down there, or the ground-launched small diameter bombs, these make it impossible for the Black Sea Fleet to sit in Sevastopol. You either lose ships, or maybe even more importantly, you start losing the maintenance facilities, the refueling facilities, the ammunition facilities that make Sevastopol an important Navy base for the Russians. Same thing with the air base at Saki. There's actually several bases there. A huge logistics hub at Zhankoy. You start hitting these things, the Russians, they can't sit there. There's nowhere to hide. So unless you're able to effectively block or stop these incoming precision weapons, it's going to become untenable. And I think that's the concept. That's what I would recommend. I should say it that way. I don't know this, but that's how I would recommend they do this. And then eventually they will figure out the old-fashioned way, how you get in there. But I think they will be very innovative and clever in how they get combat power into the peninsula in ways that we would not have even thought of.
Yeah. So one of the really frustrating things about the Biden administration has been their slowness to decide on giving these different levels of weapon systems. So no ATACMS, up till yesterday, no F-16s, and still no F-16s directly from the U.S. How much of a difference is that going to make? I mean, even if the F-16s start flowing in the training and maintenance, it's going to be months, right, until that's...
I don't understand why the decision-making process is so incremental. I think there's an exaggerated concern, not exaggerated, I think they're overly concerned that Russia might use a nuclear weapon, and so there's a huge amount of caution there. And I do believe that this is the president. I don't think he's just doing whatever the National Security Staff says or the Pentagon says, although I think they have a similar view. They're very concerned. And of course, I mean, the president literally has the weight of the world on his shoulders and has to be more circumspect than I do. But I think this is part of the reason why they've been so incremental. But the fact that they haven't made the declarative statement, we want Ukraine to win, and here's our objective, without that, then you start making policy decisions in an incremental way. Now, I don't know this. I think the Chinese are communicating somehow that they clearly do not want Crimea to fall because they don't want to see the Russian Federation collapse. So that may be one of the calculations. I don't know that. But, of course, I was happy to read yesterday that the administration, and then again this morning, has made the decision that if anybody else wants to provide F-16s, we're not going to stand in the way. And yes, we'll do training. Pilots, a really good Ukrainian pilot, in a very short amount of time, like 3 or 4 months, will be very proficient in flying that aircraft. But it's not just the pilot, it's the mechanics, the ground crew that have to be trained also. I think that actually takes a little longer. Why didn't we start this months ago?
Yeah, it would have been much better.
I asked, let's say, a very senior defense official, I said, why can't you guys at least start training in anticipation of the possibility of a policy decision? And they said they're not going to do that. So we are where we are. And there is a valid point from the administration that this is also about the long term. I mean, this is not like if you don't get it now, you never get it. So there is a long term aspect to this, which I think is a valid point.
Okay. And then in terms of something like a final, okay. let me back up. I don't think that a final settlement is really possible as long as Putin is running Russia, because any ceasefire is simply going to be a time for him to re-equip, rearm, and then the war is going to start again. And so if we think about the conditions under which you would not get peace necessarily, but a stable situation that the Russians aren't going to try to disrupt, as I think about it, it seems to me there's no alternative but to take Ukraine into NATO, and maybe even to have NATO forces forward deployed in Ukraine, so that they're a tripwire that will really raise the cost. That means that if the Russians try to start the war again, they are automatically going to be fighting NATO. I mean, they claim they're fighting NATO now, but
not
they're
really.
not.
You're right. So our great alliance, the most successful alliance in the history of the world, that's not just a bumper sticker. I mean, that's an historical fact. Of course, it's not perfect. I mean, it's a group of 31 nations, soon to be 32, and hopefully 33. Russia has never wanted to take on the alliance, because they don't want to face the combined military, economic power, and diplomatic power of all those nations. And so that's why, despite our flaws, there are several nations that are in a queue trying to get into NATO.
Right.
And why nations that used to be Soviet republics or Warsaw Pact countries, the day they could, they immediately came knocking, we want to get inside NATO, because they know they know what's out there.
If the Baltics had not gotten into NATO in the 1990s, they'd be the front line.
You're exactly right. This would be it'd be a different sort of situation. And so I agree with you completely that Ukraine's ultimate long-term security only comes with membership in NATO. And frankly, adding the best army on the continent to NATO will be good for NATO, and it will also help us have a much better strategic approach in all domains in the greater Black Sea region, which I think from a strategic standpoint is more important than even the Baltic Sea. So what can we do before we get there? I think that let's assume, and I take your point, Putin will not be satisfied with, okay, I made a big mistake, sorry. But I do believe that his number one priority is regime survival, saving himself, literally himself, and staying in power. And I can envision a scenario where they can come up with another narrative that explains why they're pulling out. Because when he sees that they're losing, when he right now he doesn't believe they're losing, or he doesn't believe that they can't win, because they can still see glimmers of hesitancy on our part. And so I think that they're like, another year, the West is not going to be able to support Ukraine anymore. And so they're going to play that out. But when he does finally realize they've lost, and I don't think that happens until he loses Crimea, then they have to come up with a new narrative to explain to his supporters and his own people why they had to leave. Okay, we defeated NATO, we stopped NATO from invading Russia, we have killed all these Nazis, and now we need to go deal with other threats. I mean, I think most Russian people will say, okay, good. Now, there will be a lot of people around him that won't be happy about that. But I think they will figure out a way for him to save his skin. And that can happen even if they lose Crimea. So that's one thing. But I saw where Dr. Kissinger, with whom, to be candid, I have not agreed with a lot he said over the last couple of years.
You're not the only one.
I mean, a legendary figure and statesman, but that doesn't mean you're always right. And I think he's been wrong on a lot of things. But it was very interesting, this interview in The Economist that just came out, where he says, actually, the only possibility for Ukraine is membership in NATO. So that was a change for him.
Yeah.
But the thing that I had not anticipated, he said if he had the chance, he would tell Vladimir Putin, you will be safer also. Russia will be safer with Ukraine in NATO. And I thought, how can that be? And he just explains it, and I think it's very compelling, that if Ukraine is not inside NATO, but yet we're arming them to the teeth, and they're going to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and we still have this kind of a situation where Russia still occupies Crimea or parts of Donbass, and they're still threatening, then Ukraine's going to come after them again. Ukraine will come after them to finish the job. And that will be a real problem for Russia.
Yeah.
So in effect, with Ukraine being inside NATO, Russia will never ever have to face a military threat from Ukraine, or like they don't have to face one from NATO.
Yeah, well, it's my opinion that we really need to think very soon and hard about how to get Ukraine into NATO, because I actually think that a peace, again, forget the peace deal, but an armistice is really not going to be possible until something like that happens.
So agree.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was terrific. I don't often get to interview military officers with lots of operational experience. If I could just ask a couple of kind of lower level questions about lessons that this war has, just military lessons. So there's been this big debate over the future of the tank. You are an old tanker, so I figure, you're probably not that sympathetic to the idea that the tank is obsolete now.
Actually, I was an infantry officer my whole life. I was in mechanized infantry in Germany back in the early 80s, so I've been around tanks, obviously. Every commander I know wants protected mobile firepower. You want that gun that can survive in a terribly intensive fight. Now, whether that looks like a 75-ton Abrams or a 30 or 40-ton vehicle that doesn't have a crew up in the turret, so you don't need as much steel around it, but you absolutely want a weapon system that can move through all kinds of terrain and that can survive and then can deliver effect with precision at range. So absolutely, I would want to have a tank. And listen to what the Ukrainians have been begging for. More and more tanks. They wanted Leopard, they wanted Abrams. And they know, if the other guy has a tank, you need a tank. Now, there is no doubt from looking at the videos that all of us have been watching of endless amounts of Russian tanks being destroyed. But every time I look at them, without fail, these tanks are sitting out in the open. They're not properly employed in a tactical way with dismounted infantry around them. If they're in a wooded area or in a town, you would always put out infantry to keep away the guys that have the shoulder-fired weapons. So, yes, it absolutely is the end of tanks that are improperly employed or that don't have crews that are trained and disciplined. When you don't have sergeants, the sergeants are the ones that make people do the right thing. So obviously they don't have that. So I guess then to the point, the biggest takeaway from me is what has been true forever, that it's the woman and the man with the equipment that makes the difference. You can put good soldiers, well-trained, well-disciplined, in old equipment, and 100 times out of 100 they will defeat somebody in a brand new weapon system that's not properly trained and led. So that emphasis on training and developing the talent of your soldiers is still got to be job one. The second thing, though, clearly as General Milley said, the character of war is changing because of technology. Everything can be seen now because of overhead imagery from drones and other sensors. So we have to learn how to protect ourselves. It's not just about green paint on your face and camouflage in your helmet. You have a thermal signature, and you also, all of us are emitting all kinds of signatures from our communications equipment. You have to protect that, otherwise you're going to be found and you're going to be destroyed. The range and precision of weapons makes that very important. And then the final point I would make here is that our president on day one at his inaugural speech talked about the importance of allies. I mean, he knew, first of all, he had to repair damage from the previous administration, but also the United States, even with the biggest defense budget in the world, does not have enough capabilities to do everything that needs to be done, whether it's air, land, sea, whatever. So being able to work with allies is going to be essential for our security. And so that's what's happening in Europe now, in NATO now, under General Cavoli, under the alliance leadership. I mean, we're in an increasingly better place in terms of readiness, and we've all been reminded from this war that this is what failed deterrence looks like.
Right. Right, and that has big implications for Taiwan and China. A lot of people have been criticizing aid to Ukraine, saying that it's drawing down our stocks if we needed to defend Taiwan. Well, so first of all, I'm not sure that they would actually want to defend Taiwan. I think they're just using this as a kind of political argument. But the other thing is, I think the war has revealed, these weaknesses in our defense industrial base, and we really got to ramp that stuff up. And I think that, now the Pentagon is thinking more seriously about that. So, assuming that invasion of Taiwan doesn't happen in the next year or so, it may actually be a kind of good warning that will get us more ready for the kinds of threats.
That's a great point. I imagine that President Xi is actually not real happy with his best friend, Friends Without Limit, President Putin, because what Putin did it woke all of us up. Mm-hmm. A year ago, we were making 8,000 rounds a month of artillery ammunition, which was exactly what we needed to meet our training requirements. The U.S. is now making 25,000 rounds a month, and they're on an upward track. And they're with the place where they make the GMLRS rockets and Hellfire, they're increasing production. So the Chinese won't be very happy about that. And I think you're also right in that the Chinese are watching this. That if we are not willing to really commit to defending sovereignty, freedom of navigation, human rights, the international law, all the international organizations, if we're not willing to do that in this Russo-Ukrainian war, then they won't be too impressed, I think, with what we might say about freedom of navigation in South China Sea or respect for sovereignty in other places. So I think these are not separate. They are, in fact, very closely connected.
The cohesiveness of the alliance was really impressive. I mean, I myself was surprised at the way that NATO responded to the Russian aggression, and I think the Chinese are going to have to take that aboard. I mean, they obviously want to split us from the Europeans, but whether they can actually do that, it's less clear after Ukraine than before. So, General Ben Hodges, thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I think the bottom line I take from what you said is that we need to be patient, that the Ukrainians are actually going to win this war. You should not assume that there's going to be a prolonged stalemate, and therefore we need to somehow negotiate any kind of a peace, in the short run.
Well, I think you're right. What Clowes would say is still true, that, the nature of war is still the nature of war. It's violent, there's uncertainty, there's friction, and hundreds of thousands of humans are involved, so you can't guarantee what's going to happen. But I think Ukraine has the potential, and the conditions or the trends are going in the right direction, I think, and I'm optimistic.
Good. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you for the privilege.
Good.